In the summer of 2019, I researched potential hiking routes to climb Mount Doogie Dowler in British Columbia. I was riding my bike down a narrow forest road when I turned a corner and saw a grizzly bear. I've seen 2 or 3 black bears before, and usually if you make some noise they'll go away. But this was the first time I'd seen a grizzly, and it was staring at me. I got off the bike because it wasn't moving. I peeked out of the corner of my eye and noticed him creeping towards me until he was only a few feet away. He almost ran over my bike, until he did a 180-degree turn towards me. I turned to put the bike between us and pulled out my hiking stick as he approached and placed it between his eyes. He pushed back a bit and looked like a decent heel until he spun his head, biting the pole and throwing it away. I took off my bag and tossed it to the side, thinking he would go there to get food instead of me. It took a while to sniff, but then he started poking me with his paw. Each poke was a little more aggressive until he raised his paw high. I thought it would do some serious damage, so I threw my bike at it. He lunged forward and sunk his teeth between my ribs and hips on the left side, and soon I was in the bear's mouth as he carried me 30 or 40 feet to the bush. I was in excruciating pain. It put me on the ground and I tried to gouge out his eyes, but I couldn't reach. I thrashed as it gripped me and began biting and tearing at my thigh. It was so painful it felt like my hip was going to dislocate. He was digging into my thigh so far I could hear his teeth grinding against my femur like a dog chewing a bone. I began to say goodbye to my wife and children in my head and felt guilty for making this journey in the first place. Then I realized I had a pocket knife. I had to use both hands as I was still pinned, but eventually I managed to get it out. The blade was less than 3 inches long, but I stabbed the bear in the neck with all the strength I had. As I drew the knife, it raised its head and a large stream of blood shot out into my waist. It got off me and walked over to my bike, sniffing it for a moment before standing back at the bush it had come from. I knew I had to move fast or I would bleed out. While the bear was still watching, I cut off my shirt sleeve and made a tourniquet on my left leg. I looked again and the bear was gone. It was 12:01 and I knew there wouldn't be any loggers until later in the afternoon. So I dragged myself to my bike, got my wits about me and started pedaling with one foot until I finally saw the loggers' cabin. The door was open and I ran into their stairwell screaming for help. Thank goodness there were 5 guys who looked panicked but took out their first aid kits and called 911 while they fixed my 60 stab wounds. One wound was so big that my kidney was visible. About an hour later, the air ambulance arrived. They put 2 pints of blood in me on the cabin floor and then took me to the hospital for a 6.5-hour operation. The next day I began 40 days of recovery at Vancouver General Hospital. On January 2020 the specialists noted some nerve regeneration in my left leg. I started running on the treadmill in February. I ran a half marathon in September. Mentally, it was much harder than I thought it would be to return to the forest. I made a conscious effort to walk into the bushes behind my house as soon as possible so I wouldn't be overcome with fear. I used tactics like playing music on my headphones to drown out the noise of the moving creatures. Since then, I've also run into a few black bears on the trails, but I yell and they get out of my way.